Embrace life with a change for the better. Challenge your comfort zone with Glenn Miller, your personal comfort zone coach, enabling you, in whatever way you may need to step outside your comfort zone. The Outside Your Comfort Zone podcast explores proactive and practical tips based on years of lessons learned and expert skills and advice that will enable you to accomplish more. Each episode puts a spotlight on topics and experts in their field who will compel you to action and to get more things done outside your comfort zone.
So hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Outside Your Comfort Zone. I'm your host, Glenn Miller, and today I am super fortunate, excited and delighted to be presenting the one and only Lindsay Perlman. Hello, Linz.
Hello, Glenn.
Our listeners out there, I like to just jump straight into it. You are a clinical psychologist, and what I prefer from stealing your thunder is if you could just talk to me a little bit about what you are, what you do, what is a clinical psychologist, what brought you to this point, and who is Lindsay Perlman?
Okay. Okay, so thanks for having me. It's great to do my first podcast ever, so it's very exciting for me. So I am a clinical psychologist, but before that, I actually was an organizational psychologist. So I've been around the traps. I worked in change management consulting. So I guess more broadly helping organizations to manage change better. And what I found there was, despite it being exciting and dynamic, I just thought it's not that satisfying because you don't really get to work with people one-on-one. And I knew that it was probably better suited to me being more in that space where, I can work with people one-on-one. So when my daughter was 1, I somehow, by a miracle, really got into the Masters of Clinical Psychology at Macquarie Uni. So I did that. I had always a specific passion with postnatal depression and kind of perinatal, they say before pregnancy. So perinatal anxiety and depression, as well as postnatal depression and anxiety. I started the Masters of Clinical Psychology because I thought I want to work one-on-one with people. And from a personal point of view, I kind of suffered a bit of postnatal depression with my son initially. So I was kind of particularly passionate. I knew that that's kind of more where I wanted to go because it could really make a difference getting the right help. So basically with psychology and doing a master's, so you can kind of do the 4-year degree, which kind of gives you a general level psychologist degree where you can practice, but then the master's degrees are varied. So there's a forensic psychology master's where you go in working with people, in the jails and stuff like that. Then there's organizational psychology. And I guess it's more working in a variety of areas. It could be in recruitment, organizational restructuring, change management, talent management, bringing the best out of your people, working with organizations to improve the culture. So specifically, I was more interested in the change side. So where we worked was helping organizations manage, like, say, a big, like a IT change or a new system or a new structure, or like an organizational structure, any change for an organization. In order for it to be most effective, it's important that the people are on board, they understand the change, they understand how their roles will be impacted, the communication, related to the change needs to happen well. So all of that, because it all affects kind of their, I suppose people's kind of attitudes towards the change and how well they actually acclimatize and integrate with the change. So yeah, does that answer your question in terms of an organizational psychology point of view? So organizations, it's pretty macro. It's kind of working in organizations predominantly.
Brilliant. Yeah,
and then,
it does.
And then when I went into the clinical side, as I said, it's kind of the more one-on-one, working with people and particular mental health issues. So the master's particularly, I guess it's more a specialized training looking at specific mental health issues, namely depression, anxiety. Those are the two main ones in terms of, they call it, the bread and butter for clinical psychologists because they happen the most to people.
Yeah.
In terms of the highest experience of those mental disorders. But then there's also ones, say, but within the anxiety field, I should actually mention, there's a whole lot of anxiety disorders. So there's, OCD, obsession compulsive disorder, there's panic disorder, there's generalized anxiety disorder, there's phobias. So that's kind of in the anxiety sphere. Then you've got the other ones. So the more the outliers, like the personality disorders, schizophrenia, I guess the substance use disorders. So it's basically giving you training, and the training is quite intense and comprehensive. You do a lot of placements in the field. So you do like thousands of hours. So it's really getting you very specialized and comfortable working with mental illness in a very specific evidence-based way, where, you know, we work with different therapies and interventions that have been tested and have a lot of kind of scientific evidence-based underneath it as well. But I also should mention, you know, they also say, obviously, the relationship with the therapist is important in kind of getting the best out for the patient too. So in terms of clinical psych, I suppose it's looking at more one-on-one with people, looking at specific mental illness. I suppose with clinical psych, you can also do group therapy as well, but I guess it's more specific to people in terms of their psychological struggles.
Amazing. So no, I think that's hit the nail on the head, because, and again, maybe just to parallel that all back to you and kind of cutting through your journey. It sounds, so you were on the organizational side. We're talking things like performance coaching, a bit of the recruitment side.
A bit of the change side.
The change management side. And interestingly, you know, so there are a lot of, you know, obviously in terms of our audience, I think what's quite cool and what I'm trying to reinforce here is, you know, you've come from the corporate side. So you know, our listeners are going to be quite varied between business professionals, mums, you know, there's some youth we're slowly attracting as well because of the topics we cover. And again, like bring it outside your comfort zone from organizational psychologists and those examples and the background you've shared of what it's all about, to then this pivot over the mum in you moving to the clinical psychologist side. I mean, you know your stuff, which is quite cool. It sounds like whilst they're these specialized areas, I suppose tying back into that relationship you've just mentioned with a psychologist is so important. So I think what I'm hearing you say is psychologists might have varying backgrounds, much like yourself. And it's probably a good idea, having heard this, that if any of our audience are thinking of outreach or talking to someone, that they do their homework, so to speak, across who they're talking to and which of these fields they covered and which specializations they in. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, just a couple of, I suppose, pointers. The fit is key. So, you know, sometimes people go and they meet, like, I don't know, they meet a psychologist for the first time and they don't feel kind of a vibe. I think the vibe is very, very important, because they say that actually it's kind of like a crazy statistic, but it's like 70% of the therapeutic effectiveness is the actual relationship between the patient and the psychologist or the therapist, whereas 30% is, I suppose, more of those kind of evidence-based treatment interventions. So if the person, say, you know, in your audience goes and wants to go and see a psychologist, don't kind of be disheartened. Don't think, you know, it's a bit of a painful exercise, but the fit is very important. That's definitely a key. The other thing is, with the clinical psychologist as well.
So I had a episode through the, you know, we were in the tsunami in Thailand, you know, almost 20 years ago now. And I think that's what kind of drew us together when we were talking before, when, you know, in our pre-preparation, that that pairing you're speaking of, I do want to just resonate with our audience a little bit, that I was in the tsunami. We saw the wave come. Where we were was, you know, people were running. It was scattered. It's a story for another time. My point is that 2 years off, like, I'm a talker, right? I came back from that trip, and Jackie, my wife, and I, she's not much of a talker, but, you know, we go out for friends and dinners, and it was obviously very topical. The world, we thought it was a tidal wave. It was a tsunami. You know, you heard about Banda Aceh and all these different places. It was in the news. You couldn't escape it. My point is, for 2 years, I thought I was fine. You know, I've spoken about it, and, you know, any research you do says talking about it helps, you know, the mind, get it out. Jackie wasn't a talker. She didn't have dreams. You know, 2 years later, I found myself having the same recurring dream. You know, on separate mountains, and I couldn't get to her. And then night sweats, and, you know, I was planning these exit strategies, then living my life, you know, sitting at a bus stop, stuff like that. So the point is, I felt like I was actually in an abnormal world, and I reached out to my mum at the time, and I remember distinctly where I was, and I phoned her and I said, this is not normal. Like, planning exit strategies and having these recurring dreams keeping me up at night is not normal, and I need help. And, you know, I had that mindset, and I phoned her and I said, look, you know, mum, please, I don't know, as mums do maybe, in our little community, like, I just need a name and a number and someone that can help me. And I don't know how, but I was given a number and a name, and I went to see a woman, and that pairing you speak of, I was just very lucky because I felt it. That individual, they weren't interested in digging up my childhood and a whole bunch of, you know, you hear funny stories. But since this episode, so they helped me, they fixed me up. we had just 3 sessions. I remember saying to them, how do I know when I'm fixed? And her response was, are you still having the dreams? And no, I'm not. Are you still having the night sweats? No. Are you still planning exit strategies? No. She said, well, then I think we're done. Now, I've spoken since then to other people that have, seen psychologists, and for some, it's not that easy. And it's so interesting what you just said, because we didn't discuss this previously, you and I, just like that high statistic that if you get that pairing wrong, because on the flip side, I know so many people that have tried to talk to a psychologist and they kind of come out of it saying, not convinced, that nonsense is not for me. And I think, again, what's so important for listeners is I challenge them to say, look, if at first you don't succeed, try again. That old cliche, but I think it's true. And perhaps they just got the wrong pairing. And if you're reinforcing it by saying, yes, there is a statistic there. And if you're part of that statistic, maybe you didn't find the right fit.
Yeah, absolutely. But on the other flip side of that, I think sometimes people kind of expect very quick results as well. And sometimes, depending on what the issue is, sometimes 3 sessions won't cut it. And, I'm just using yours as an example. And I think that is one of the things, these days, everyone wants instant gratification and they want their kind of issues to be fixed and for us to kind of be magic wands to kind of, or unfortunately, we can't just give them a pill and for, the issues not to be kind of there anymore. So it's just kind of like having, I suppose, that openness to just kind of go with the process, as long as it's obviously, the right fit and you feel, I guess, like the sessions are making a bit of a difference and they kind of providing a bit of relief. Sometimes you have to be patient, because when you think about it, people come for a variety of reasons, but all of these kind of things that maybe have gotten in the way and are causing them difficulties are very ingrained ways of being, ways of responding, ways of dealing with life that are habitual, they're ingrained, they've been there for years. So it's unrealistic to think that after 3 sessions, you are going to have greater awareness and like a real understanding of how everything links together, but also how to have more space, because that's kind of the way I work, creating more self-awareness and space to think, okay, well, hold on, before I'm going to pause and I'm going to respond slightly differently, because I know the other way of responding kind of gets me in trouble and it's kind of linked to an ingrained kind of story that has evolved over time.
Well, and I think so. Again, I'm seeing 2 distinct, and there's probably more. And I'm sure we could, I think we're going to have to get you back here, because there's so much stuff we can talk about. But I think what I'm seeing there is, in my scenario, there was a specific event, right? And I think what I'm reading between the lines, maybe for some people there was a specific event that was far grander than mine. I read David Goggins's book where, he was abused as a child physically. Some people have had to endure with mental abuse. I'm sure all of that is a whole different topic. But my point is, for some people, it's not as intense as that. Like my episode was a one-off. Yeah, it was grand and big, but it wasn't a lifetime of pain. That's my point. And what I think you're saying is, for some individuals, it's not that clear cut. You had an episode. The outcome was this PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a bit like you've got a sore knee, so you go to the doctor. They do an x-ray, they fix the problem, it goes away. I think I was fortunate that for a PTSD clinically diagnosed case, it's as easy as that. But what I'm hearing you say is that there's obviously many, many situations that are long-term, perhaps. So perhaps it's a short-term approach versus a long-term approach. And so again, coming back to that pairing, I would imagine. So Lindsay, how does somebody go about, like, how does someone work out what is a good pairing? Because okay, I don't know how people land in front of a psychologist other than their doctor's referral, right, in the first place. And I'd imagine even that, we take a step back, often it's family and friends saying, I've noticed behavior change or something. So maybe let's unpack, like, what are some of the symptoms, the indicators to look for? If you think there's someone in your life out there that has a mental challenge, like, A, how can we look for that and diagnose it as a person in the street, a family, friend, loved one? And then B, like, how maybe we walk down that journey of how that individual can land up being paired with the right person.
Okay, so in terms of, I suppose a lot of people say, like, how do I know when it's a problem? Speaking personally, so for yourselves, if you are struggling with something, I think the key indicator for me is if it's interfering with life. So if, say, you're anxious about something and it's really getting in the way and mucking life up for you, as in daily life.
So mental consciousness that there's this thing like I had, right? But there's this, it's like you're actually in that headspace where you're thinking about it too much.
Yeah. Or, it's kind of like you're avoiding something, or, say you're a bit self-conscious and you don't like kind of socializing. So you're avoiding these parties, or, I don't know, or you kind of worrying about something to do with.
Well, like postnatal and prenatal, like what?
Yeah. Well, there's different. So there's the one hand, it's kind of like, okay, well, how do I know? Because the thing is, everyone, I think, goes through some sort of low mood and anxiety at some point. And, it's not necessarily like we don't necessarily need to pathologize it. It's usually just, I don't know, part of everyday life, because life is hard at times, and it involves suffering, and it involves some worry, and it involves some low mood, which is fine. I guess the thing is sometimes, I guess, knowing when that difference is, when that kind of like, that crossover into the more kind of clinical side of things, where it warrants seeing someone or medication even. And that is if it's really interfering with life. So if it kind of lasts long, and if it's kind of really getting in the way of everyday life, then that is kind of, that's I suppose, a call that maybe, one should kind of get some help. I suppose with depression, like common signs are withdrawal. So if the person say, you don't see them that much, they tend to not want to go out that much. They tend to not kind of, I don't know, say it's a child always likes to do sport, or always likes to go and see friends, quite social, and then suddenly stops doing those things. We know with depression, it's usually indicated by a loss of, or a loss of desire to kind of engage in pleasurable activities. It could also be obviously, crying, kind of not really talking, so just being quite withdrawn, loss of appetite, perhaps disturbed sleep. Those are kind of the key things. I don't know if I've missed any, but those are the key things that that indicate maybe it's not just kind of, every day. And I'm not saying like even with normal people, normal people with it. Sometimes if you've got something kind of and that's anxiety provoking for you, you may not sleep that well. But this is, I'm talking kind of more of a pattern, more of like a chronic pattern where you notice a couple of weeks and they're like, something's changed here. They're gone a little bit like low. They're a bit more kind of, withdrawn. They're not really participating. Their mood is a bit funny. I guess
maybe it's like you've seen someone 1, 2, 3 times. Like the first time you noticed a change, the second time you're like, oh, wow, yeah, I'm thinking about this change. The third time it's like, wow, I've seen so-and-so, before. And no, this is like really different. So I'm framing it that way because if any of our listeners, you're thinking, somebody, and this is what you're seeing. And I suppose in conversations, like, people that are probably more closer to home where they might say, yeah, like, so that change is that big indicator, something's different, and maybe what was the catalyst and what's going on, which is obviously more obvious and prominent. Yeah.
But I also think sometimes it's tricky because I know, teenagers say, you've got those hormonal changes which kind of trigger some sort of behavior change sometimes around like being a bit more moody, maybe having a bit of a lower mood, being a bit kind of a little bit not, maybe withdrawing, becoming a little bit more, just sleeping a little bit more. I think it's just important to not kind of panic or anything, but it's just to kind of watch how that goes. And I suppose it's tricky because I can, there's like the parenting side, there's like your individual, it's friends where, they all kind of require different tacts. But I think it's kind of, noticing a pattern over days or weeks where there's been some sort of withdrawal, some sort of flattened mood or depressed mood.
And it's ongoing.
Yeah.
So even I think so what we're highlighting is you might have an event-based something that leads to a mind shift, a change, a mental change, which is maybe shorter term. You might have some kind of other event then, like a baby's born, right? Like you said, prenatal, postnatal, again, maybe more medium term in that space in time. And then it sounds like you've got, maybe things that have happened to people in childhood that they've carried and probably not even known it. So I suppose, Linz, the first two examples of immediate short-term, mid-term, those are probably identifiable and resolvable. I suppose if the intervention, if the presence of mind is there, or loved ones around, a mum who's pre or postnatal, it's way beyond the postnatal, the child's 2-3 years old maybe, and the signs are still there. I suppose that might be a good use case for, okay, if a relative were to say, look, you're not all right. Like, so I think, we'll get to how to talk about these things. Perhaps we'll get to that if we can, but I suppose if we can look more maybe at the long-term one, because I think the first two are a lot easier identifiable, probably more conversational in terms of our loved ones and how those around can help manage that.
Yeah.
And I suppose maybe it's a segue to how to deal with it then is like the longer-term ones. Linz, how do you think loved ones can help identify that? Is that a more tricky situation? Because I do want to bring it back to pairing someone, because I think even in these, if we grouped it into these three scenarios, immediate short-term event, mid-term, long-term. And again, I'm trying to frame this more from a layman's point of view, right?
Right.
You look at the long-term one, which I think is probably more of a community-wide issue. If I think of mental illness and how I've heard it publicized, I think that's the group that maybe is the hardest to identify. Is that a fair?
So when you say long-term, just clarifying, Which group are you, or what kind of presentation are you referring
Maybe
to?
I'll give you two examples I can immediately think of. One for
Yeah.
me was 8 years old. I saw a giant baboon spider in South Africa when I was finished my third session with my psychologist, and she kind of said, right, cool, you cured.
Yeah.
Half an hour left. And she's like, do you have any other phobias?
Right.
Like, actually, I do, right?
Yeah.
Arachnophobia. And she ran through some things. And I know you and I spoke about this, but
Yeah.
it definitely desensitized me. I was in a
Right.
situation where if a spider was on the outside of my car windscreen, I'd slam on brakes, hop over Jackie's lap, car running in the middle of the road.
Yeah.
So that's one example. I suppose the other is, I think we all have a relative, I'll just frame it that way, that might have had issues. When I say issues, I don't mean it that way. I mean, maybe they lost a parent, or they were a Holocaust survivor, and they've carried that kind of long-term mental weight. And I'm framing it that way because, again, it's not a blame thing and it's not an issue. It's maybe they just don't know, or maybe they do, and they don't know how to get help, because, even men who beat your chest, rah, tough and brave, can't show emotion. I think it's happening, luckily, in the world we live in, it's easier. But I think that's the second example of these long-term events that maybe there was something little in childhood, in my case with the spider, but maybe there's an emotional, mental. And I think, again, I don't want to go too deep into the abuse part of things, because I'm sure that's a whole different kettle of fish. But let's just talk more common. Like I say, sorry to use that example, a Holocaust survivor, descendant, or some traumatic event that happened. One loses a parent at a young age and has to look after other siblings, and they're so tough and strong for 30 years. And then, you hear of these episodes people have. So I think that would be the second one I was referring to, like that longer term.
Got it. So you're saying, in a way, well, I think it's tricky in a way, because sometimes the person needs to be ready to see someone. Like I've had some situations where a partner's called me on behalf of, say, their friend or their partner themselves, and saying, I'm worried about her, she's not coping, etc., etc. And then sometimes it actually doesn't kind of work out, because that person, the patient themselves isn't ready to go there. And I think at different times, I think sometimes even, using the example of like becoming a parent for the first time, whilst it's so amazing and so exciting and such a, an incredible experience, it does and often brings, that anxiety and that kind of like overwhelm. And sometimes it can even trigger, because the only way we know how to parent is based on the way that we were parented. So I guess reflecting on that journey can kind of trigger these kind of all these emotions around, say, if we had a hard upbringing, and a hard relationship with our parents. But I guess what I'm saying to you, it's tricky, because the person themselves ultimately needs to kind of decide on when they're ready to see someone. Yeah. And I don't know if that answers the question.
But I suppose it's not an answer per se, but let's look at this the other way. Like, if we could give someone out there a tool set, on the one hand, to identify a relative that has this, but then what I'm hearing you say, if that relative who becomes the patient isn't aware of it, I suppose there's a few steps here, which I'm trying to unpack. Like, if someone, firstly, they may have this event in their minds that outsiders can see, but they don't see it. So what I'm hearing you say is, not only do they need the presence of mind to want to address it and fix it, but maybe they don't even know, or maybe it's been suppressed for quite a while, and then it comes out, and then people around them notice that. But so what I'm trying to cut straight into is, if I have a loved one, that's in that environment, I think there's an issue there. Like, are there tactics that one could talk to that person subtly and not drop a hint? Or is it something better, you hit it straight on the head and say, look, I'm worried about you. This is what I've observed. This is what I'm seeing. It's not healthy for you. It's not good for you. This is what you can do to seek help. Because how do you make that, like you said, that person, you got to take the horse to the water and make it drink. It doesn't work that way. Is there a way you can prompt them to see the light almost? And
so you're saying, in a way, is there, if you actually identify people kind of, behaving in ways which signal to you that something else must be going on, are you saying, what is the best way of perhaps approaching them and being able to have a frank conversation with them so that they can get the help that they need?
I think that exactly. And I think there's two sides to it. One is the loved one around, and the family, the friend, the support network that identifies. Coming back to your question before, the person that is then the patient, I suppose it's, how do they get outside their comfort zone in that long-term environment where, if the penny drops, that they see, I need to step outside my comfort zone here and maybe go talk to someone. And also it brings in, imagine the relief if there's a solution out there. And I think some people listening might say, wow, that is me. Like, wow, I did grow up with X, Y, Z. I do feel this way. And I think, tying in what you said right at the beginning, I've lived my life differently because this thing's weighing on me all the time. I suppose what I'd love to hit into is, when that penny drops, they must have this they feel this mountain to climb. Like, it's just too hard. I'm not going to see someone. So I think if this podcast, if one person listens to this and says, you know what, I'm going to give this a go, and I'm going to frame this a little bit differently before I turn it back to you, Linz, that there's two choices here. Do nothing and nothing changes. Stay in the comfort zone. But if you push yourself to get out the comfort zone and address it, then life might change from that day. There's that saying that says, this is the first day of the rest of my life. But imagine if it could be different tomorrow. So I think maybe people are in such a difficult space, and they don't even realize it perhaps, or if they do, they don't know how to get out of it. So I think we've spoken about trying to pair with the right person, but how can that person come to terms with it, I suppose? No.
Well, I was kind of thinking on what or how to answer that. I guess, a lot of the time it kind of feels like it's in the comfort zone, but we do know that when one avoids kind of things, and when one kind of has strategies in place that just kind of shut down, in a way, it is inadvertently making the anxiety worse. Because it's kind of saying, look, if I kind of open myself up to it, I'm going to kind of feel all these feelings. And obviously I don't want to feel all those feelings. So then I'm just going to avoid it, which inadvertently says I should be scared of whatever issue that I want to, that I have. And I suppose the idea is, I guess getting comfortable with not being uncomfortable, and being able to perhaps make the steps to improve, or to kind of, sit with whatever difficulty we have in a more open way, is totally liberating. I mean, I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I also saying, in terms of therapy can be really uncomfortable. I mean, I had someone yesterday in my office. He's like he's mid-20s, and he hasn't really ever committed to therapy. He's kind of come to me, and then he's gone, and then he's come to me, but now he's decided he's like, definitely now he's on board to kind of come. And you could see, there was like a lot of discomfort with kind of talking about things which made him uncomfortable. And the idea is, that movie Inside Out, where I think a lot of the time in society, people think that we always need to be happy. Everything always needs to be good.
Perfect.
And
this
perfect.
utopia.
And only the positive emotions are what we want and what are normal. And all the negative emotions are ones that we should avoid, shut down, etc. But I suppose they're there to serve a purpose. And again, for me, I think that life, as I said before, everyone's going to have anxiety. Everyone's going to have low mood. Everyone comes with their insecurities and their baggage and their relationships from the past. They may not be that clinically, to kind of cause like severe depression, but they're struggles. And I think, and I don't know if we're going off topic, but I do think that there is something around like having a different relationship with all of these different emotions, so that we can kind of sit with them in a way where, one can not be overwhelmed and just be a little bit more comfortable. And so, because I always say to my patients, you're going to have times when you're going to be very stressed, and there are going to be times when you feel like really bad, and it's part of life. And I think the more comfortable and the more, say, working with someone, like myself or any other psychologist can help you, I guess, ride through that discomfort and be able to form a different relationship with it, so that, when things get hard, you don't need to shut down and you don't need to kind of run away, but you can kind of acknowledge, oh my God, this is kind of making me uncomfortable and this is triggering me in some way. But what I'm going to do is I've got some skills to kind of like take the edge off, and then I may need to go and talk to someone more about it, or maybe I don't. Maybe I'm just kind of noticing it and I'm just going to roll with it.
No, I think it does answer the question perfectly, because again, you're in a world where you're close to it, and you studied and you trained, and you've obviously had all these scenarios. But I think so many people out there, I love what you said about, the more you suppress it, the worse it gets. I think there are a lot of people out there probably do identify with this. And that's why you have beautiful things like Mental Health Week. And, I really want this episode to be always on that. I think it's a big issue that people don't talk about enough. And somehow with podcasts, you can listen, which is great. And the point is, if somebody's out there thinking it over and over, I mean, I'll just, again, using a good example for me, the way I equate it is, the body gets sick, right? We've just gone through COVID. There's people that don't want to get vaxxed. There's people that are vaxxed. People are still walking around getting COVID, right? So the body gets sick, and sometimes there's antibiotics. You get a runny nose. No medicine's going to stop the nose from running. You do get things that block it and suppress it, but the issue underlying is still there. And I'm using that example. So I think the mind can be sick for a while, right? And that's why I'm almost breaking it up in lay terms to short-term events that are probably more easier, quicker, fixable in inverted commas, medium events like a birth, right? That it's such a beautiful thing. It's such an irony. But for mums that have pre or postnatal depression, it's a major struggle in their lives. And then again, this long term, because one is identifying it. And then for people that are sitting saying, wow, that is me. right? Again, what I want to throw out there is, what do you have to lose? So I've said this before, and I think my second podcast I did on time about, I wake up in the morning, I'm a happy person. I'm born that way. I think it took me a while and a lot of maturity in adult years to realize some people are born the opposite, right? The glass is half empty. And you know what? And what you're saying is, if we recognize that in the people we know, we love, we care for, I'm lucky that I wake up and I'm happy and I'm smiley. And I think you're pretty similar, but that doesn't mean we don't have demons. And for some people, it's the corollary. It's like life is hard, whether it's work or, things were flying and awesome, and now someone lost their job. I think the point is, in all these examples, we're all human, and people need to be able to recognize if they need help. That's my point. And that, one can keep going the way they're going, but there's always the opportunity to, we need people around us. But if you have someone you can reach out to and say, hey, I need help, like I did. And then B is, okay, I'm asking for help. Now, who do I see? I think drawing between the lines, people out there are feeling that. The best thing I'd say is step outside your comfort zone. And if you're sick and tired of feeling that way, right, that there is an option rather than continually suppressing it.
And I also think, like, when you said to me, what are the signs or how can I tell? I think a lot of people, they have these kind of problem behaviors, which are coping mechanisms to manage, feeling, whatever they're feeling. So, some people may use alcohol, some people may use, drugs, some people may indulge in, like, overspending or diet or exercise. And I think it's kind of, sometimes we need someone else to kind of point it out to us, because we're so far into it that we can't kind of see the wood and see that it's a problem.
So those are some of the signs, right? That's brilliant, because that's a little mini list of things people can look out for. Again, not always the substance abuse side of it, but just common things that we don't always look for. But if you stood back and said, oh, hang on, actually, there's a repeating pattern here. Like you said, this is not normal.
Mother needs a drink, every single night. Partner or kids, you're noticing that, that there's some kind of
like unusual patterns,
like coping mechanisms, like I've just said, around, really kind of doing something in a very compulsive, very obsessive way. It often may be to cope with these difficult emotions. So I think that, I mean, I'm just kind of putting it out there in terms of kind of therapy. Often I also think that it's not even, I kind of want to almost create some sort of society where speaking to someone is kind of not seen, with a stigma, or that you've got like a problem and you're not coping. But it's also sometimes having that kind of objective space to be able to kind of, unpack and process a whole lot of different things in your mind, so that you've got greater clarity anyway. So
no, I get that. I think 1,000%. Like, I'm going to say it, and again, I think we live in extraordinary times. TikTok and virality and Snapchat, and even the kids, unfortunately, they are exposed probably to more than they should be, whether we like it or not, right? That's what tech's done. But even more so, I want to use it as a segue, Lindsay, into the types of cases you might see on a daily basis, because that also helps people to resonate.
Okay.
But I think that in our daily lives, I'm saying it to men out there especially, cut the nonsense. Like mental disorders, mental challenges, mental difficulty is a thing. It's normal. It's fine. And on the contrary, I think there are many advocates out there saying it's normal. Like I say, there's a lot of different organizations and things set up. And so again, something I'll come back to at the end is like what people can do if they want help and they need to seek help and they need to talk to people, but we'll get to that. I just think it's not okay not to talk about it anymore, especially when someone feels like life's not normal. I'm waking up. There's some of these symptoms we've described. Go out there and look for help. Your options are things will change for the better or they'll stay the same.
Totally. And it's okay not being okay.
Exactly. Exactly. And maybe sometimes the first step is it's okay not being okay. And that's going to lead to a next step. Like this example you've used with a younger person where they went, they came back, they went, they came back. Maybe that was them realizing that it kind of settled.
And I think also, sometimes people kind of come to therapy in a crisis. And I sometimes say to them, like, it's not always for crisis management. I mean, often that's why people come. But, sometimes you can actually do really good work when there's no crisis, because people are more settled. They've got better perspective. They've got a clearer mind. And, it's an opportunity to perhaps kind of look at some of these kind of self-limiting, narratives or stories that have kind of evolved over time, and helping them say, okay, well, when do they come up for you? And where do they make life difficult for you? And can we maybe break them down and perhaps, have a bit more of an objective kind of view of them, so that at least they're not as rigid. We've got a bit more flexibility. So So yeah, I mean, I think that it can be really, life changing, as you say. I mean, I think, say, using this man as an example, he found that he was better, and then he was worse, and then he was better, and then he was worse, and then he's realizing that things kind of keep coming up. So no matter what he's trying to avoid it, thing like this difficulty for him which is his anxiety, comes up all the time, which does muck life up. He struggles to go out and be with friends, or put himself out there at work, or take those work opportunities when I think it can be hugely helpful for people, kind of having that containing objective space to talk through difficulties.
And Linz, let's cross over to the type of like scenarios you presented with, and specifically, I suppose you and I spoke, the type of people that come to see you might, it's cognitive behavior therapy. I think you said you do dialectic behavior therapy, psychotherapy, schema therapy. These are all big names, but maybe we can just distill that back in more layman terms, the other side of it, that, by all means, please cover like what some of those things are, if I've got it right. I hope I do. And then just looking at your website, which again, we'll share with people so they can find you if they need to. If you just relate some of the day-to-day terminology people use who end up at you, and what their life might look like, that then bring them to you so that you can manage some of these things and what they are.
Okay. Adolescents, in late adolescence, say from like year 10, so like 16 onwards. And I think, at various different life stages, you're going to have kind of different issues that kind of pop up, across those different stages. So people come to me for various things. So either, they've got severe anxiety, which is affecting them at school. They're having difficulty even going to school, or socializing with their friends, or doing exams, or doing competitive sport. Or, people at uni, say, having the same issues, or maybe people in that kind of age bracket. So more of like the coming out of year 12, so early adulthood, say 20s to 30s, say, finding it difficult to kind of get that structure back in their lives. They're feeling overwhelmed because, school's very structured, and then they come out of school, and then they've got this transition. They don't know who they are. They don't know what they're going to do. They're feeling like they don't have all the answers. And then they need to kind of also, develop new friendships groups, etc. So all of these kind of things, I suppose, for those two population groups that I'm talking about, are causing them with significant anxiety, or some anxiety, and affecting their mood. So, I'm not saying like some people are very depressed, but usually the people I see, they've got some sort of flat mood, low mood, sometimes don't feel like getting out of bed in the morning. But it's not that kind of very severe clinical depression some are, but, for the most part, it's more like, it's actually called adjustment disorder. So it's saying, okay, I'm noticing I've got these patterns, and I'm just feeling like a bit anxious. I can't really sleep that well. My appetite's a bit off. I'm not really wanting to see my friends. I can't really focus, because I can't really focus on my uni work or my school work. I feel my attention's all over the place. So those are the kind of main things. And I suppose those issues, then say continue into the next phase of life, where, kind of the mums I see, I'll say, late 20s onwards, or mid 20s, where I suppose it's that kind of depression and anxiety around motherhood, and coping with becoming a mum, and, the role change and loss of identity, and just kind of, putting a lot of pressure themselves on whether they're coping as a mum, as a parent. Also see a lot of dads who may be also struggling because their roles changed, their relationship with their partner has changed. I can even do some, we even do some like couples therapy around like working more cohesively together during that change, because it's a huge, one of those big life changes, which kind of are documented in terms of those big stress life events. And I suppose, at different phases of life, one encounters different changes and different strains and challenges. So then they may trigger usually anxiety and depression. So in terms of the way that I kind of work with people, drawing on some of those therapies that you mentioned, my main approach is to more work in the relationship. Because I find that given, 70% of therapeutic effectiveness, as in 70% of how well someone does in therapy, is attributed to the relationship, I kind of work in the relationship. And I also kind of find that when you've got a strong relationship, you can see, patterns that come up in the therapy, as in the way that person is relating to me, or what they're doing, is usually the problems that evident in the session and outside.
And I suppose the relationships as well with the people connected to them, that both of those influence as well.
For sure. But, I suppose it's more in the therapy, you can, work with a person to say, give them a corrective experience. So, being able to have better communication, or be more assertive rather than aggressive with people in their world. And so those kind of changes that we can kind of establish in the relationship can then kind of generalize outside. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then, so I kind of work in the therapy a lot, but then I always draw upon, because I think these days people do want quick fixes. And I guess to an extent, those are where the strategies are really good, because you can have a toolkit that when you're feeling overwhelmed, this is kind of what you can do. You can do a grounding skill. We can look at, these kind of faulty thinking styles. So people come in and they assume that every thought that they have is true. Whereas in a way, the brain generates millions of thoughts, and not all is true and not all are fact. And I guess it's our job in the therapy to say, okay, well, which are the thoughts that are working for you? I'm not kind of saying, okay, just pick the good thoughts. It's more being objective and saying, okay, well, hold on. Where does that come from? That's linking to more of that kind of story that's evolved over time, which I think is kind of making life difficult. So we kind of work on looking at the underlying beliefs and the thoughts that come out of that, and then helping them kind of create more awareness, so that at least if they have this really bad thought, they can at least say, okay, hold on, I'm noticing that this thought is coming up for me. I'm just going to pause. I'm just going to take a few deep breaths. I'm going to slow my body down, and then I'm going to do something else to have a different impact.
So like coping mechanisms. Got it.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I do I call my therapy, and what people usually do, I imagine, is like a two-pronged approach. The one thing is to give them like the tools to kind of manage day to day, like in a better way, so that life is more enjoyable.
Yeah.
But then the more long-term potentially is that more the deeper work to say, okay, well, where do these come from? Like why, where do these kind of self-belief or these beliefs come from? And let's try and understand like the relationships that you've had with your family, et cetera, not in a way to kind of, make people feel bad about the past and angry at the people. Yeah. But, it's more of a compassionate, people do their best, and sometimes people don't have awareness and insight. I guess it's around, kind of being able to create more of those, creating a bit of movement around some of those stories that have really mucked life up for them to date, and to kind of be a bit more able to like loosen them so that they're not as stifling.
Well, and I think, look, like for you to come on here today, the field is so broad. And again, I didn't want to go too deep into what you do in sessions and how you do it, because I think that's exactly what happens behind the closed door. And clearly it works, and clearly you've got an awesome strike rate. But again, what I've learned, it's such a broad field. And when when you and I, started talking about what we could talk about, I can see this is massive, right? Which is obvious.
Totally, yeah.
One thing I just want to ask you, Lindsay, because I think people often think about this.
Yep.
And excuse me if I'm naive on this, like the difference between psychology and therapy, is it one and the same? Are those different things?
Well, it's tricky because, you've got, say, a counselor who is trained in terms of, they could say they do therapy, which they do. They more talking therapy. Whereas I suppose a clinical psychologist, where I do talking therapy, but I also perhaps have, a little bit of more specialization around the specific mental illness. So I think therapy, and it's tricky. Okay. It's like, I don't know, differences in training, differences in registration, differences in the amount of, experience and exposure they have to, say, the range of mental illness. So it's, they are used interchangeably, but I suppose it's like finding someone who works well for you. Like if you find a counselor who's really lovely and has a really good rapport with you and listens to you and helps you kind of figure things out, then great. I think there's a place for everyone, but it's kind of the same in a short.
But maybe, Lindsay, even rather than that, as a step towards maybe, summarizing or heading towards our close, I think what I'd like to reinforce is maybe it's kind of secondary. It really isn't of consequence. I just know in my own conversations, it's like therapist, psychologist. I think it's less actually relevant. What I'd love for us to achieve for the listener is, and maybe again, in summary, today we've covered that what someone listening could look out for, and just correct me if I'm wrong, is some major life change or a change in your normal
in behavior or presentation,
and whatever that means to you, right?
Yes.
And that might be seen from outside people, support network, etc., or that might be seen by the patient themselves, right? And I think what I'd love to stress is we've kind of spoken about almost three types of scenario, like a short-term, very specific event. Maybe a medium term, just longer form, similar, like some kind of event.
Maybe like a stress at work or something, a difficult relationship.
Maybe someone had a stroke, right? Yep. And maybe someone's had a fall and they've broken their hip and they're immobile. Yep. And it was a month of trauma. They didn't sleep. It was 3 months of medication. It was 6 months of rehab. Now it's been 3 years and they're still down.
Yes.
Like maybe that's medium term, right?
Yeah.
And then longer term, which it feels like maybe the result is matched with the incident. Because if someone's had 60 years of pain, 50 years of pain, you can't expect the quick fix. And I think generationally, that wouldn't be the assumption, but we live in a world where phones, everything's like you said, it's instant gratification. That to me, I think, just to summarize, is probably the hardest, the biggest. Maybe as a framework, it's like, because then we said, how does that person seek help after 60 years of difficulty? Like, one, what I heard you say is you've got to identify that this is there, but that it is fixable. Which means, I think, number two, you actually have to understand it to a point within yourself, or people looking in might sensitively try and explain, look, I've observed this, this, and this. It's been like this for a very long time. But then third, after you've identified and understood, is there is something we or you can do, but you have to be willing to do it. And if you want to keep going as you are, well, nothing's going to change. But there is an alternative. You can wake up tomorrow and decide to try.
Absolutely.
And I think that brings me over to you, Lindsay, that if someone does want to try, what are the things they can do? Straight away, I'm thinking, I hear them advertising Lifeline in Australia. Brilliant thing. It's there. People might be too proud and think, well, I'm not trying to commit suicide. So in that kind of Australian, what options could you offer people? Because some will say, oh, it's very expensive to go see a psychologist, which it is. I know there's also with doctors, there's a program. I think you can sign up and get an assessment, and there's a Medicare rebate, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know what the program's called. But maybe you can talk about some of these options, Linz.
Okay. So basically,
what's the easiest thing someone could do?
Well, if you really feeling overwhelmed and you don't have any support, you can call Lifeline, and you can call other helplines out there beyond Blue, and there's a children's one and a domestic violence one. I don't remember off the top of my head, but
I'll research them. We'll put them in the show notes.
Yeah, they're more like the kind of acute response kind of places. We're feeling really overwhelmed, suicidal, any of those things.
Yes.
But if you really want to get help, that's where I suppose getting that referral from your GP. So they'll do something called a mental health care plan, and they will give you. So there are different tiers of rebates. So with the clinical psychologist, you can get back $130 per session. So whatever there may be you can go to the bulk billing psychologist, or you can go to other psychologists where there'll be a gap, and they can give you 20 sessions now per year of the rebate, which used to be 10. And then with COVID, they've increased it to 20. And then, just by the by, with eating disorders, so people who really struggle with that, because that's a massive area, they've actually given you 40 sessions. With that, you have to go see a psychiatrist. A part of that is very regulated. Structured, yeah. But I guess in terms of getting that support with seeing a psychologist, if you want, you can go get that from your GP, and they'll give you the referral, and then it will be very much, the GP and the psychologist will be kind of in, work collaboratively together to help you. And then, if say a psychologist then says, look, I'm kind of worried. I'm seeing this therapy is maybe not enough. Just coming here with, to see me every week. I'm going to kind of refer you on to a psychiatrist, and then you'll go back to your GP, and then you can get a referral for a psychiatrist, or the GP can maybe give some medication as well, which sometimes, and I'm quite conservative in the way that I work, but sometimes I say medication does work to kind of feel a bit more stable, level out your baseline, so that at least all the work that we can do in terms of the talking therapy can be more useful. So that would be the best thing. I also think, Glenn, I always say back to basics. Is the person exercising? How's their appetite been? How's their sleep? Because all of those things, in a way, we kind of need to have them fairly stable. You're not going to eat perfectly, but at least that's also important, I could say, for any listener today to kind of think, okay, well, how is that? And let me maybe see if I can kind of make some changes, because I'm a big fan of exercise. I know you exercise a lot, just for the mood. So if you can kind of do that anyway as an interim before even you go, you get the help you need, I think that in a way can really take the edge off.
Awesome, Lynn. So, and again, I think in closing, people, there are things you can do, both for the patient, the love around you, but just give it a go. So like you just said, Linz, if you notice someone or you identify with someone out there that you think mentally is struggling, then take them for a walk. Invite them for a coffee, get them out of their zone, their comfort zone, and into something a little unfamiliar, because that might actually resolve certain things. It might, depending on how drastic. And then lastly, we live in Australia, but even for our global listeners, so you're here in Australia, we're just very fortunate. I think there's a lot of these structures set up. So one, to anyone outside of Australia, look for your line in your local area. But also, I think the point is just ask for help and I think you'd be amazed that, in Australia, we've got all these great channels and rebates and the structure's there. But if you live in a world where you don't, that doesn't mean you can't talk about it, and people around you can certainly help.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
just get the conversation started, I would say, more than anything.
Yeah. And you know what? I think you'd be surprised. I mean, never judge. Everyone's going through some sort of battle, and it may look good on the outside, but everyone struggles with something. I believe everyone. There's always. So I think just getting help. I mean, it can be life-changing.
It's the saddest part of this, the cliche. There's always someone worse off, but let's turn that into an opportunity and say, not go discover them, but let's flip that around. Let's get people help, and let's get people helping themselves. Most importantly, don't be afraid, and stop. Ironically, get it out of the head. Stop thinking so much and just do. Just get it sorted.
Yeah, take that first step.
So, Linz, thanks so much. That was like so cool.
Oh, great. Well,
Awesome.
there's like just so much that I suppose we can cover, but I'm hoping at least it like provides a good start for people who have never really thought about seeing a psychologist, or maybe, been wondering but not knowing kind of how to do it.
Do you feel like, Linz, was that what you were expecting, or didn't know what to expect? Did it align with your expectations today?
Yeah, I suppose, like, I think sometimes you assume that people know a lot more, or, you think that everyone knows about psychology and everyone knows what it involves, what it is, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's just kind of like breaking that down and making, like, not assuming that. And I guess there's probably are a lot of people out there not really that familiar with psychology and not really familiar with when to go and what to look out for and all of that. So we stayed in the one place for longer than I thought, perhaps. I don't know.
And the other thing is, I think if there are areas you'd like to have talked about that we didn't, I think we should do it again. And I'd love to get you back, because I didn't realize it's so broad. But I've been taught, like, between you and I've been struggling a bit with my dad, because we lost my mom.
Right.
My brothers and I are conscious and talking about it, and it's weird. They lived with us for a while, and that's why I was saying I didn't say him, but he's the one I'm talking about, drawing on personal, where I think 16 years old, he lost his dad. He had to fend for his mum. He provided for her, for work, for life. She lived with him. Right. And now there isn't a day, almost every 2 days, like that, he says, since I was 16 years old, I've been doing X, Y. And I know my mom, like I'm saying, he's the one that wakes up very negative every day. And my mom used to lift him up because she was his daily therapy. And now that she's not there, I'm worried. Like, this is where you have people get caught in a hole. But I think, again, Linz, that I've been talking to a lot of friends, males, men, 40, 50, 60-year-olds. And I genuinely think all these things I ask you, we're going to see, right? But I do think that at the most basic form, the average person walking around out there is that far removed, that they don't understand it. And people like my mother-in-law, who's a Holocaust survivor's daughter, and my mother-in-law, Jackie's side, Nanette, who, she's got some, like, eating and all of these things you spoke of, that I do think this conversation, often people just assume. And when they hear it and it feels familiar, that's why I really wanted someone listening. Lynn, so if someone needs to reach out to you, do a bit of understanding in what you do, and perhaps even get in touch, just tell us how people get in touch with you. How do they find you? Mention your website, please.
So my practice is called Infocus Psychology. Great. So the website is www.infocuspsychology.com.
Yes.
Contact us. Your name, your email, and write a couple of things. If you want to, I kind of always say I offer a 15-minute free phone consult just to kind of have a chat around, like what's happening. Booking a session is something that could be good. So always open to that. So that's probably the best way of being in contact.
And I know, Linz, we've mentioned it today. We've spoken about how deep and specialized and broad your field is. And so if we haven't covered, what people had hoped for, I'm going to encourage the community around us to contribute, like comment into we're going to share this on social, etc., on the YouTube channel. Please, feedback if there's targeted people that those out there listening, if there's targeted areas you'd like us to get Lindsay back and talk about specifically, please let us know. We'd love to do that. I just wanted to explore maybe some assumptions people make that weren't covered out there, that we could address and hit a nail on. And really, like I said, I want people to go away, step outside the comfort zone. If it's going to help them, I stress that. If they think that they don't have an option and this makes them feel like now they do, just go on some of these resources we've mentioned. Yeah,
definitely. And, always happy to cover off on things. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what people are wanting to get more information on. So, that will also be good for me, because I sometimes like to kind of put together one pages just for people to kind of take away. So whatever I can do to kind of help.
We've achieved our goal today and through this podcast. And I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I really look forward to having you back. I hope we do, because I think there's so many little rabbit holes we didn't go down that we could have. And I just really look forward to having you back next time. So thanks so much, Linz.
Thanks, Glenn. And I hope the listeners found today helpful.
Thanks for listening to Outside Your Comfort Zone with Glenn Miller, your comfort zone coach. If you like what you hear, help spread the word. Subscribe to the podcast and invite a friend. For show notes, links, and extra goodies, visit comfortzonecoach.com.au.